If you've been up to Wohl Basin, you know, as you're approaching the park boundary, so you're going towards the east, it's a stream. It's steep, it's narrow, it's laterally confined, there's not much floodplain, so it looks like a stream on a map. But then you come to that gorgeous beaver meadow that I got labeled as a bead here, which is right by the park boundary. It's a bead because it's wider, it's a lower gradient as you go downstream, and there's space there for a lot more patchiness, in this case created by beaver. So if you think of any river, the length of it is as being these alternating beads and strings. The research that we've been doing, and lots of other people have been doing over the last couple of decades, clearly indicates that the whole length of the river is important, but the beads are disproportionately important. That's where you have more patchiness. You've got more habitat diversity, habitat abundance. You have more of that biomass, biodiversity. It's a really good place to store things that are moving downstream quickly. I've been working at North St. Vrain since about 2005, so I saw the 2013 flood with very high flows of 2010 and 11, the fires, and the bead is a safety valve. It slows down floodwaters, it stores a lot of water, so it's more resilient to drought or to fire. So whatever aspect you look at, the beads really are the important part of it. And one way to think of this, I'm using the term retentive. That just means that everything moving downstream has more opportunity to be stored in the bead. And it may be very short-term storage. Floodwaters, the seasonal snowmelt peak, it may be a few days to a week. It could be thousands of years if it's sediment. And some of the sediment at the base of that North St. Vrain bead, you get radiocarbon dates of 5,000 years. It's not necessarily a specific length of time. It's just that everything moves more slowly downstream, and there's potential for storage in those reaches. So another way to think about rivers is that things don't just move downstream. If I'm a river, I'm not just going this way, I'm the water and the sediment. Something more like this. I'm trying to hypnotize you. There's lateral movement, so from the channel into the floodplain and back. There's vertical movement into the bed of the channel and then back out of the bed and into the atmosphere. And ecologists in particular started us thinking about this as three-dimensional connectivity in a river. So longitudinal is moving downstream, lateral is moving between the channel and the floodplain, and vertical either into the stream bed or up into the atmosphere. If you have a bead that's got all these patches, there's a lot of lateral and vertical connectivity. So things are, again, not just simply moving downstream. They can, let's say a cobble can move into the floodplain and it can sit there for 300 years. I'm making numbers, obviously. And then it goes back into the channel and eventually goes downstream. So the more patchy or heterogeneous and the more beads you have, the more you can retain things. And retention is good. Think about what happened after Hyde Park or Cameron Peak. The hill slopes shed everything that came out of the sky and brought things with it. So water, sediment, ash, charcoal, any of the contaminants that were with them. Fort Collins had to shut down water intakes because there was so much material coming into the cooler fast. So if you can slow the movement of that material and keep some of it scattered throughout the watershed and move it downstream more slowly, it's much more beneficial. Same thing with a flood. If you've got beads and you've got overbank flow where the channel overtops and some of the water goes into the floodplain, it moves downstream more slowly. So retention in rivers is generally really useful, good. Sorry, no matter what I do, I'm gonna go in and out of volume with this thing, I think. The last point I want to make with beads is that they're resilient, and resilience is a word that's used in lots of different contexts. In rivers, it means that when there is a big disturbance, like a fire or a flood, the river can return to its pre-disturbance condition more rapidly. Beads are more resilient to both natural disturbances like fire and flood, or some of the things that we do because of these characteristics that I've been talking about. And I'll come back to this idea at the end and give you some more specific examples. Wow, I didn't touch anything. I think it's anticipating me now. Okay, so some examples of what these beads look like. Just zooming in, this is the upper Colorado River Basin, fairly high up, but going down, you can see the beads in Google Earth or in any type of aerial imagery. They show up as different colors because they've usually got different vegetation. They're not the standard conifers that are in the adjacent uplands. They're often willows or grasses and rushes, wet vegetation. So continuing to zoom in, this is, you can see a trail there. Didn't touch it. Look at that. It's taken on a mind of its own. Okay, there's the bead. I'm going to try standing over. Yeah, that was a bad idea. Sorry, whose laptop is this? It just, sorry.
I can't guarantee that I'll be any help, but I have my fingerprint. That's what I want. I think that you might work out.
Oh, yeah. Maybe I'll just leave one finger here on the key thing for advancing. So there's a bead continuing to zoom in. And on the ground, this is an example of a stream. It's steep, it's narrow, there's not really any flood. So that's an example of a beaver. And in this case, it's a former beaver meadow. It's not occupied by beaver now, but their engineering lives on and creates this very nice retentive portion of the valley with these ponds that are off the main channel. Okay, so coming back to the idea of river corridor and three-dimensional connectivity, a simple block diagram looking, let's say, upstream. Start thinking about how material moves downstream. So there's water and there's anything dissolved in it. And in our part of the world, the major thing of concern is nitrogen. It's a nutrient that we just have too much of. And it creates a lot of problems. So water and solids moving from the adjacent parts of the, say, the uplands into the river corridor, moving between the floodplain and the channel, and then a lot more arrows. All these versions of three-dimensional connectivity. So moving between the channel and the floodplain on the surface and the subsurface, moving between the deep groundwater, the shallow flow, which is referred to as hyporheic. It's just think of it as right below the stream bed. And the point is that almost nothing just moves simply downstream at a uniform rate. There's a lot of exchange going on. And the more exchange you have, the slower the downstream transit time, and the more you can have this temporary storage and resilience. So in the bead portions, they're wider, they can have more of that patchiness, more three-dimensional connectivity. And if you say river corridor, you're more likely to think about some of those connections. Okay, so, right. Oh no, that's okay. Spatial heterogeneity. A couple more examples. This is an old beaver complex in Rocky Mountain National Park. This is on the west side by Grand Lake. No current beaver activity. And you can see a little bit of spatial heterogeneity there. There's evidence of abandoned channels that are holding water at the bottom of the photo. But look at this one by comparison. This is up by Independence Pass, an area of active beaver, lots of dams, lots of ponded water. The dams aren't completely blocking the channel. There's, of course, still downstream flow, but they're creating all these wetland environments along the channel. And another abandoned beaver meadow. This is in Eastern Lake Creek on the west side of the park. So I'll just finish this part of the talk by saying, hopefully when you look at this, you'll start to think about all these different dimensions to rivers. So there's the dashed lines are supposed to be in the subsurface. So there's water and dissolved material coming in from the adjacent uplands. There's water and dissolved material and sediment coming in at the surface. There's things moving back and forth between the channel and floodplain. Of course, there's things moving downstream. Up into the atmosphere, there's evaporation. There's aquatic insects that are emerging as winged adults. A variety of aquatic insects in their larval stage that live actually beneath the stream bed in a hyporheic zone. So the degree to which these three dimensions of connectivity occurs partly depends on that patchiness of the river corridor, and that's best expressed in the beads. Okay, so I'll come back to that idea of resilience. And it's a little hard to see, but the drought, fire, and flood are the three terms in the upper right there. This is that beaver meadow at Wild Basin again. So looking down on it from the trail to Sand Beach Lake in the upper photo, and then at ground level in the two lower. There's a lot of standing water. The middle photo is an abandoned beaver pond. It's way away from the main channel. It's over by the valley margin, but you can see it's still got a lot of water in it. And the upper photo was taken in late summer, but you can see areas of standing water. There's multiple channels that branch and rejoin through that valley. That's a nice fire break, and it's also very resilient to drought. There's just a lot of water stored in that part of the valley. It's in the sediment, it's at the surface, and the vegetation has more moisture in its tissue. So there's higher moisture in the veg too. So it's resilient to drought and to fire. And the bottom picture is at ground level. It's a little hard to, it's actually very hard to see, but there are three channels coming together there. I took this in early June when the willows were just starting to leaf out. If you ever go up there, there's no trails on this, but you can walk into it from the road that goes to the parking area at Wild Basin. Bring chest waders and bring an attitude that will keep you happy when those chest waders are overtopped, and expect to move very slowly. Nothing moves fast with that willow car. Car is an ecologist term, it's C-A-R-R, it's a willow community, including floodwater. So in 2013, I was working up here, I was desperate to get up after the flood. And first all the roads were out, if you remember that if you lived here, so there was no way to get to the park. And then they repaired the roads remarkably fast and our federal government shut down, so you couldn't go into the park. So eventually I got here and I couldn't tell there'd been a flood. I know some of you must have lived here, but do you remember what happened in Boulder and Lyons and other areas? There was huge amounts of erosion and deposition, landslides all over the place in the lower part of St. Vrain. But here, when I got to the upstream end of the meadow, there was some wood and some sediment deposited at the head. That was it. It was really resilient to the flood because all of that, what hydrologists would call floodplain roughness or hydraulic resistance, slowed the floodwaters and kept the floodplain intact. There was no erosion and deposition at this part. So if you have a bead, it's got all these patches, it's really resilient to a variety of disturbances. And an example of this from Idaho, it's a little hard to see there, but it's Owl Creek. I got colors really great on that. Doesn't quite look that way normally. This is from my colleague Joe Wheaton at Utah State, and another colleague, Emily Fairfax, who's written a paper with a great title, Smokey the Beaver. And she has looked at the effect of beaver ponds in areas with a burn. And boy, you can see this after the High Park fire in 2020 in parts of the South Fork of the Poudre, along the main stem Poudre, where there were beaver ponds, it's standing waters where they don't burn and the vegetation around it doesn't burn. So not only can they serve as a fire break, but they can also catch a lot of sediment when the rains start after the fire. They can serve as refugia for a variety of animals. They can serve as seed banks and recolonization sites for a variety of organisms. So just another example of that resilience. And within beads in our part of the world, that patchiness, three-dimensional connectivity, the resilience are enhanced by what the scientists can't resist. So I call them biotic drivers, but other people would call them beavers and log jams. There are lots of things that create patchiness, but these are the two most important ones that I've seen in this Colorado population. So I'm going to focus on beavers because this is a series about beavers. And as I'm sure you all know, they're called ecosystem engineers. They're called keystone species because they modify the environment in a way that is both persistent and spatially extensive and affects a lot of other species. So in the context that I've been talking about, if you've got a bunch of beaver dams and ponds, you're decreasing the longitudinal connectivity. Each dam is an obstruction to things moving downstream. But that obstruction can force flow overbank onto the floodplain, and it can force flow down into the subsurface. So it increases the lateral and the vertical connectivity. And because of that, you've got some water that's being stored on the floodplain surface and some that's being stored in the subsurface. So you've got a higher water table. This is the Fall River in Horseshoe Park. I don't know if any of you have been up there in the last few years, but there are beavers moved in and they have been doing amazing things. These photos were taken last August. 2 years ago. Yeah, time flies. 2 years ago. They built dams all over the place, and what you're looking at here is one of the dams, but then the lower photo, the inset, that's water that's just cascading off the floodplain coming back into the channel during late summer base flood. They flooded the entire floodplain. And there's an enormous amount of lateral and vertical connectivity now because of this one pair. They also, if you're spreading water across the floodplain, you're reducing the amount that goes out during the highest period of flow, whether that's the snowmelt peak or rainfall peak. So they're attenuating the peak flow. And that water goes downstream more gradually, so they're often increasing the base flow, which is going to become more and more important in Colorado as we get warmer and drier summers. They're also trapping a lot of sediment. So this is a place called Little Beaver Creek. It's a tributary of the South Fork Poudre that I had been working in prior to the 2020 fire, and then most of the watershed burned, which was kind of emotionally difficult, but scientifically it was pretty exciting. It was a really interesting natural experiment. So there was a lot of channel erosion. If you can see, there's a pair of feet there, but look at the color of that sediment. You don't usually see really black sediment like that in Colorado unless it's full of ash or charcoal. And this isn't. It's full of carbon in a good form. So the kind of organic carbon that we'd like to store, that you get in the wetland soils. The wet soils around beaver dams are perfect for sequestering carbon. And I understand, I heard when Ben Goldfarb gave a talk, somebody had a question about carbon. It's a double whammy because the wet soils create what's called high primary productivity. You have a lot of happy plants who grow a lot. And those plants shed, it's an unfortunate term, but they drop plant matter. It's just dead leaves, twigs, pine cones, etc. So there's lots of organic matter going into the soil. When you drop plant parts, there's microbes in particular, microbial communities in the soil that say yum and eat it and emit gases. But if the soil is saturated, there's fewer microbes that can basically live in those conditions. So a lot of those dropped plant parts just accumulate. So you're building up this carbon-rich layer through time that has this beautiful black color, and it's just being exposed in the bank after this fire. The lower photo, that's an old beaver dam. That line, the dark brown in front of it is sediment that was mobilized after the Cameron Peak fire in the first couple summers. That beaver dam has been abandoned for a long period of time. The channel is actually at the back of that photo. You can't see it. It's going to the right of the beaver dam. But the dam is still storing a lot of sediment. So you've got a natural sediment trap. Again, if you've lived here long enough, you remember what happened after Hyde Park and Cameron Peak. There were debris flows coming down everywhere. Black Hollow, not too long ago, people died. And fish kills all the way down to I-25 on the Poudre because there was so much sediment and ash. If you have lots of natural retention structures like this scattered throughout the headwaters, that can really reduce that type of effect. There's also improved water quality. So N stands for nitrogen. And as I mentioned, if you're not aware of it, we have a severe problem with nitrate pollution. It's mainly from what's called atmospheric deposition. So it's coming out of the air with snow, with rain, with dust fall. It originates in our feedlots and agricultural areas and our tailpipes of emissions. And most of it is coming from fossil fuel combustion. But we have overloaded the systems on the east side of the Continental Divide so badly that they've lost most of their ability to absorb nitrate. And they're just shedding it. And okay, so what? Well, nitrate creates blue-green algal blooms. You do not want it in your drinking supply. It's bad news for a lot of reasons. So if you can have natural nitrogen sinks like beaver ponds or like these wet meadows, that helps a lot. If you got a lot of obstruction, you're slowing the rate of velocity of the water, you're reducing the erosive force, so you're going to have more stable channels, less erosion, and lots of habitat and biodiversity. These are all pictures in that area of Wild Basin. And if you can see Mama Moose, her hackles are up. I got way too close because I didn't see her, and I was going through the willows, and all of a sudden we were like this close, and her hackles went up, and I moved the fastest I've ever moved in chest craters. I got a little ways away and then took the photo. But there's an awful lot of plants, animals, microbes, everything that ecologists have looked at. There's more diversity in beaver meadows because of that habitat diversity and abundance. No, okay. There we go. This is the upper part of the Poudre, just below Poudre Lake in the park. If you've ever walked from Poudre Lake down towards, say, the Long Draw Road, there's a long open area that is full of old beaver dams. There's no beaver there now, but I tried to make this a little more obvious with the dashed line. The white arrow is indicating the flow direction, so there's shrubby willows growing on the downstream side of this vegetative berm that's an old beaver dam, and the fill on the right of it. whatever you look at, you can look at Edwin James's description from Stephen Long's expedition. You can look at, well, Pike didn't write about it because they were too busy trying to stay alive, but Edwin James with the Long expedition, Fremont, any of the early descriptions, they are describing abundant beaver, although by the time Fremont came through in 1842, he's writing about how many abandoned beaver lodges and dams, and it was a big deal when they found beaver still present. So shortly after the Lewis and Clark expedition, the beaver trappers came to Colorado, started trapping, really didn't quite completely extirpate the beaver, but severely lowered the numbers. But by the 1840s, the commercial trapping pressure was declining. The beaver started to come back, but they've never come back to their historic levels. So both those historic records and all of these features that we can see on the landscape indicate that beaver were far, far more common historically in Colorado. And what does it mean that we've lost them? So bear with me for a moment, a little bit of the diagram. The dashed line here is a threshold. If you have beavers that are able to build dams, you have this feedback that occurs. So the dams are obstructions. They're creating backwaters upstream. They're forcing flow over the channel banks onto the floodplain. So I'm starting at the bottom of this gray circle and moving clockwise. If you have backwaters and water going onto the floodplain, you're also likely to get secondary channels that branch and rejoin. If you've ever walked through a beaver meadow, the animals have a, I think, very annoying habit of digging canals all over the place, and they're exactly one beaver width, one body width, and they're impossible to see until you fall into them. And they're not fun, they're vertical walls, but those canals that they dig can also become secondary channels. So you've got this branching network of channels and rejoining. That high water table makes willow, aspen, river birch, alder very happy. You end up with very dense deciduous riparian trees and floodplain wetlands. That's really great beaver food and habitat. And I know some of you are watching this online. I'm not sure how well you can see my hand, but I'm holding it up with my fingers extended. If this is a multi-stem willow, if an elk or a moose browses on this, they'd be nibbling on the tips of my fingers. They eat the growth tips of the plants, so with time, the plants become stunted, and under extreme grazing pressure, there's no surface expression. Beavers would be nibbling at the base of my thumb or fingers, and when that happens to a willow, when one of those stems is cut off, it resprouts as multiple stems. So beaver and willow can coexist for long periods of time without the beaver eating themselves out of house and home. So that wet environment, creates beaver food and habitat. You get more dams and ponds, and it's this very stable, persistent condition. It's spatially extensive. It can occupy the entire valley floor in a bead. It's persistent. We are not allowed to use motorized drilling rigs in Rocky Mountain National Park, so I had some hardworking grad students who used hand augers. We went as deep as we could, and the beavers have been there continuously for 5,000 years, probably longer than that. It's complex in the sense of being spatially heterogeneous, and there's that strong three-dimensional connectivity. To the other side of this, if the beaver leave for some reason or are actively removed, either they're outcompeted by moose and elk, or they're trapped, or whatever, the beaver dams fall into disrepair. So you're losing those obstructions, and the backwaters and the overbank flows decline. When you have high flow, say the snow melts, a seasonal peak, all that water is concentrated in one channel. So it's got a lot more energy. It's going to erode the banks and cut down. That lowers the water table for the whole valley floor. And ecologists refer to this as an elk grassland. And just to be really confusing, if you go to Upper Beaver Meadows in the park, for example, or Moraine Park, those are effectively elk grasslands. They were beaver meadows historically. They're basically mostly grasses, very few willows, drier environment, mostly a single deeply cut channel rather than that network of branching channels. And either of these states can be very persistent. The beaver, as long as the beaver are present, they can maintain a beaver meadow. But once you go to this condition, and that, I'm sorry, you probably can't see that lower inset right photo. It's beaver brook in Beaver Meadow, National Park. Single deeply cut channel. It's really hard for beaver to establish and maintain a dam in there. So now, I think this audience in particular is very familiar with beaver dam analogs or BDAs, except in the park, they don't want to use the word dam, so they're SBSs, they're simulated beaver structures. But they're putting some to basically recreate some of the conditions that the beaver would create in the hopes that eventually there will be enough sediment deposition and enough rise in the water table in the floodplain that maybe beaver can come back and reestablish in these areas. So while the beaver are present, you end up with these beads that are resilient to those different disturbances. There's a lot of nitrogen stored there and nitrate. There's a lot of carbon that's stored, and there's much greater biodiversity, which is why groups like wildland restoration volunteers are mimicking beavers. Okay, so not everybody loves beavers. I know it's hard to believe, but actually, a lot of people are bipolar. Or communities are bipolar. They hate beaver, but they really like them. People hate beaver, if they do, because of the hazards. So beavers, there's this idea that the sound of running water stimulates them to build a dam, and they have to build a dam if they hear running water. That's not at all true. There are what are called bank beavers. They're exactly the same species. We only have one in North America, but they're in big rivers. They can't possibly dam them, so they build their dams into the ground. The reason beavers build dams is that the entrance to the den has to be underwater. That's their way to avoid predators. So they're just trying to raise the water table under the water level on smaller rivers by creating a dam. But they will also dam other things like road culverts or irrigation intakes. So people often don't like that. If there's enough of a backwater, it can submerge roads or other types of property. People don't like that. A beaver's teeth grow throughout its life. I found a beaver skull a few years ago, and if you imagine the front teeth, they start back here, and it's like a big semicircle that comes all the way to the front. Those teeth keep growing, so the beaver have to keep chewing. So if you've ever seen some of those giant cottonwoods, a meter in diameter, the beaver have chewed, and there's no way they can move it. They're just keeping their teeth in check. But if you have limited riparian trees and it's your property and you don't want the beaver to cut all the aspen down, that's another reason people don't like beaver. When beaver first flood an area, there's an increase in methane emissions. Methane's a greenhouse gas, a very potent one. It's carbon and hydrogen, CH4. That declines with time, but if you have a lot of beaver moving into an area, this is a concern now in the Arctic, in Alaska, as the permafrost is warming, it's releasing stored carbon, and these newly flooded areas are releasing methane. So that may be another reason people don't like them. So there are some hazards associated with it. But then on the other side, there's the benefits. So greater lateral and vertical connectivity, greater surface water storage and subsurface water storage, attenuating those peak flows and creating higher base flows during dry periods, the dense woody riparian vegetation and that roughness that can really slow down the movement of water and sediment downstream. That can improve water quality, more stable channels, greater habitat and biodiversity, organic carbon storage. These are all the things I've been talking about. So there's the title of the talk is, I think officially is Saving the Dam. That's the title of a book I wrote focused on the North St. Vrain, the wild basin beaver battle, but looking at beaver around the world. One of the things that I realized when I was doing some of the background reading for that was we've had these periods where beavers are in fashion, then they go out of fashion. So during the Dust Bowl, Soil Conservation Service was actively reintroducing beavers in a lot of places in the continental U.S. trying to stop channel erosion. During the 1950s, there was another phase. During the 1980s, now we're in a phase, we can just hope it lasts longer, but things like the Beaver Restoration Guidebook that was put together, I'm sure you can't see this, but it's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, U.S. Forest Service. So at the national level, people are really focused on how you can either mimic beavers, reintroduce them, protect them where they are, but work with beavers. There are tools that are publicly available. This is a great acronym, it's BRAT. It's the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool that developed by people at Utah State to take publicly available data like digital elevation models or digital topography, the National Stream Network, land cover, vegetation data, and you can use this model to predict at least the carrying capacity based on number of dams. So a few years ago, there's a group of people who know her very well here. This is Julie Scamardo's master's, and she used BRAT, applied it to the whole state of Colorado. And this is what we came up with looking at current dam density, and I know you can't see the numbers, but the red, there's no dams, and there wouldn't have been historically the rivers like the South Platte, the Arkansas, they're way too big for beavers to dam. They probably were living in the banks. But I think this is the most interesting figure. This is dam density difference from prior to European settlement versus today. And now red is bad. There's a decrease of 15 dams per kilometer or greater. So basically just think of red are places where beaver could have been present historically and they're not now. So we know this, we've had huge losses in beaver population density. So as we try to bring them back, I think I want to just end with, it's not a either or. There are a lot of intermediate stages. It's not, we're going to have beaver or we're going to kill them. It, as with so many things with people and the natural world, it takes just a little bit of tolerance and a little bit of creative thinking. So these are all very simple, low-tech ways to exist with beaver. The two at the top and the one at the bottom, just put a fence in the water that keeps them from damming up a culvert or an irrigation intake. Or you put a flexible tube through the dam, the fence at the end of it, that limits how high the water can get, so how much can be inundated. A fence or some other type of deterrent to keep them from cutting down riparian trees that you like. And Campbell Creek, one of the wildland restoration level 2 sites that Julie worked on with their masters, a different style of BDA, and we were looking at the effects of that. Another style, the two at the base there are Fish Creek up in Estes Park. The one on the right, actually, they are beaver at the site, so they use beaver chewed wood, and I just imagine the beavers looking at the human-built ones and going, so this is what they did within a week. There's a reason we talk about busy beavers. They got going and they made a very impressive dam. And if you're familiar with the Fish Creek Road, it's at the south end of Estes. If you're going between Route 7 and Route 34, you can see the beaver activity very nicely. Also, just want to say that there are very few places in Colorado that are not suitable for beaver. This is the Fox branch of the Nature Conservancy. It's out by the Nebraska border on the Arickaree River, which is intermittent. This was taken at low flow. There's barely enough water to overtop a pair of irrigator boots. But when you get back next to that beaver dam, which is hard to see, but it's outlined by that white dashed line, I overtop my chest waders. And there are parts of this river that are dry, but if there's some water and there's some vegetation for them to eat, to live through the winter, to persist through the winter, beaver can survive in some pretty amazing places. So I think one of the questions is, how many beads should there be? How many beads are there? Where are they located in catchments like the Pluter or some of the others that are around us? And historically, this is just an idealized map view. Each of those ovals is supposed to be a bead. I think most of our mountain rivers look like this. They were the wide reaches and they were fully functional. They had all this patchiness. Today, the beads are still there. We haven't removed the wide valley bottoms, but we've disconnected the channel from the floodplain, either directly or indirectly, by removing obstacles, by regulating the flow, by putting in levees, a variety of things that we do. So in future, one of the open questions, I think, for everybody, including wildlands, is where should you focus? Should you focus on the headwaters? Should you focus farther down? Where do you get the most benefits? And based on the work we're doing right now, it looks like focusing on the smaller headwaters and trying to get multiple beads restored across those is the most beneficial, which is nice because in our part of the world, those are mostly federal lands along the Forest Service, where they may be more amenable to restoration. So I think this whole idea of where should the beads be restored and how functional is a nice opportunity for the research community to work with practitioners and the general public. But we do have to start with the idea that people are amenable to beaver coming back. And I know I'm preaching to the crowd here, and you probably have seen many of these books, but there have been a lot of books on beavers lately. And if you haven't read Enos Mills's 1913 book, In Beaver World, it's a very fun thing to read. If nothing else, he describes things that we can't see today. So he talks about beaver colonies being attacked by grizzly bears in Mackinac National Park or by wolf packs. Maybe the wolf packs, we'll see. But it could be one off of the grizzly bears. But they're all really interesting books. So I think I'll just end with a really nice photo that's not mine. It was published in National Geographic for the tea time, but if there's time, I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. So I just started as a hydrologist with the USGS, and I heard about a project that was gonna go into the Upper Gunnison, like a BDA project that was nixed because the water rights, they thought the evaporation that was gonna come off the beaver dams was gonna interfere with the water rights of people downstream. But in my mind, it's gonna increase the water. But they couldn't come back with enough evidence to show that that wasn't gonna be the case. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a critical question. I'll just repeat it briefly. It's the issue of water balance and water rights. So a potential project in Gunnison that was mixed. Just use your word, because they were concerned about evaporative losses and what that would do to downstream water rights. There was a bill that was, I should know the number, SB something, heard about it a lot. There was a bill that was passed in the state legislature earlier this year that is basically saying number one, if you can show there's historic evidence of beaver occupation. And number two, if the ponded area is likely to be below specified surface area, which I don't remember, then you can do that. You don't have to worry about water rights. It's not a taking. But those are the two key criteria. The more important question, though, is I have yet to see a comprehensive hydrological balance. So when you have a beaver dam in a pond, you have increased evaporative loss. I mentioned that the vegetation has more water in it. And plants have some structures called stomata. They're like our mouths. I'm losing water as I talk to you. It's evaporating out of my mouth. Same thing happens with plants. If they've got a lot of water in them and they open their stomata, they lose water in the atmosphere. So transpiration, it's called, can go up. On the other hand, you're also recharging the alluvial aquifer, the water table in the valley bottom. You're storing water in the ponds. Which of those, the net change is it's not well known. Most people study one part of it, including me, and it's going to be very context dependent. So what I'm thinking of is if we're at 4,000 feet on the Colorado-Nebraska border, you're probably going to have more evaporative loss than you do at 9,000 feet in the Rockies. So we, for the time being, I think the best thing is what the state legislature has done. But ultimately, we need more studies that quantify all aspects of the water balance and the carbon balance. So there's that methane emissions, but there's also carbon storage. And I think carbon storage exceeds the methane emissions, but there haven't been comprehensive studies. These are not such easy things to do.
Thank you.
The legislation is SB 212, SB 270, and there are trainings on how to implement it in the field. So if you Google it, you'll find them.
Thank you. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it was just a few months ago. It was in the fall, I think, that they passed that.
It's what?
It was just a few months ago that the state legislature passed that.
Yeah, it hasn't been very long. I think this is the first year it's in place.
And I know adjacent states, Utah and Wyoming in particular, are developing similar legislation. So.
Talk a little bit about permanence, relative permanence and impermanence of beaver structures. I'm interested to see some of those real historic areas that beavers lived in decades ago that are still showing beaver dams where I think we know that a lot of this stuff moves around.
Yeah, when I was working on saving the dam, I was going up to Wild Basin every couple of weeks and I decided I don't know anything about beaver psychology. It's fine, it's perfectly good. And then 2 weeks later, we full again. So there, I think the oldest continuously occupied pond is something like 70 years, but mostly they move around a lot if they've got space. So at Wild Basin, in the course of a year, they could build 3 new dams and ponds, but 3 or 4 others would be abandoned. So that's part of what I think maintains the patchiness. They're moving all over the place. But if it's a I've also seen beaver dams in Rocky Mountain National Park, just a 10 to basin, there's 30 feet upstream from some of the biggest waterfalls in the park. They really trusted their dam building. So they will build in very steep, narrow river valleys. I don't know if the 2-year-old beavers move out of the colony, they go somewhere else, and that's a period of high mortality. So I don't know if those are the juveniles who couldn't find good habitat and didn't make it, and there's still remnants of the dam. When I start to say those, if they're in a very narrowly confined, limited area, they probably try to maintain a snow dam or a single set of dams, but where they've got a wide valley bottom, yeah, they're moving all over the place. So it's, when I say that the beaver meadow is persistent at Wild Basin, that bead has persisted as a beaver modified environment for at least 5,000 years. Individual dams, just beavers.
Kind of building on that, I'm really curious to get your thoughts. You know, there's things like the Brett models and some of these discussions about the carrying capacity for dams, especially when thinking about something like restoration. And I guess where does that come in with, you know, like that beaver meadow might have accommodation for a huge number of dams, but how does that relate to the number of colonies that really could be there populating a dam versus one colony building and abandoning that kind of dynamic?
I'll preface my answer by saying I'm not a biologist, but my impression is that's not very well constrained. As far as we know, there's 3 active lodges for Wild Basin, and a lodge can be anywhere from the mated pair to 12 animals. If they've got usually the maximum number of kids is something like 6, so they have to be young of that year, and then the 2-year-olds, so that would be about that. But if any of you are familiar with Dale Creek, or I'm sure everybody's familiar with Otterbox. The Richardson family, people behind Otterbox, and they bought most of a watershed that is called Dale Creek. It's on the Colorado-Wyoming border, and it's tributary to North Dakota. And they're doing a lot of environmental restoration work. But one of the things they did was introduce beaver. 2 beaver built 21 dams in 1 kilometer of channel in 1 season. So that's far more than they need that conservative and they want to get into their assets. I've never seen anything in beaver biology or ecological literature that says beaver, a mated pair will build X number of dams. And in single individuals will build dams too, both male and female, even if they're not a mated pair. It's key for their habitat underwater winters in the lodge. So it's a long version of it. And I don't think anybody knows. And I think it's very context dependent. Maybe they build more dams if there's food for them.
Question, your photo that you showed of the beaver dam in Horseshoe Park, is that in an exposure?
Hypothetically, yes, it is in an exposure. I said this. This just amazes me. Yes, it's definitely in an exposure, but the Park Service has video from like the trophy cams of a moose they have named Atlas jumping a 7-foot tall fence. So Atlas is inside there being very happy with all the food that nobody else can get to. But yes, it is supposed to be in this. And I've seen cow elk calf in inside other exposures, and they always leave that gap. And I don't think the elk, especially the calves, they're not jumping, they must be jumping. But I mean, you know, a few animals get in, but there's still the exposure does have a big effect. So yes, that's the exposure. It's the last one down. As you're going down.
Okay.
I would highly encourage you to visit if you want to experience a beaver meadow. Either Wild Basin or this exposure on the Fall River, 2 of the best ones, but don't expect to see that in the literature.
We have a question from one of the people online. I'll do my best to read it correctly. They say, in the post-fire world, many organizations have implemented log structures due to the available burnt material and ease of implementation. As these structures are filled in and integrated into the stream systems, do you think they can function in a similar manner to BDAs, i.e. floodplain connection, bank recharge, shifting vegetation regimes, etc.?
Yeah, I do. Well, since I've got the mic, I'll just repeat the question. In burned areas, can some of these structures that are being built with on-site materials to create an effect similar to a BDA, mimic beavers effectively? Yes. Partly it depends on whether there's a tolerance for the structure being flanked once it's filled. What I mean by flanked is that it just erodes into the bank and goes. I have seen, well, the beaver pond that I showed the one photo of the creek in the South Park Cooter filled to the top after a couple of years of runoff after the fire. So they do fill. If you have enough space and the land situation allows it, it's ideal if you can allow the channel to go sideways and wind up. And I think the most effective is if you have the ability to build a series of structures rather than just one on the channel. Because you've got that cumulative effect of multiple storage sites. If you can have a channel going around, you're now creating an abandoned area of wet sediment that's going to become vegetated with plants. Eventually, you have other types of emergent riparian vegetation, and you've got new channel environments. So the short version is yes.
There's one more from online, I think. Sure. Somebody else is asking, do BDAs have a place in restoration of non-headwater streams, such as in semi-urban areas?
Yeah, so the question was, do BDAs have a place in restoration of non-headwater streams such as semi-urban areas? Yes. The one BDA that I showed on Fish Creek is right next to the Fish Creek Road. It's not on Cheerley Ranch. It's a very narrow portion, but so I've been going up through the Fish Creek neighborhood before the 2013 flood, and it was a riprap little channel, but after the flood, it was a very eroded little channel, and that's when I realized the things we put under the streams in other areas, like pipes and so forth, because they were all exposed and hanging on the eroded banks. That's not going to go back to anything remotely resembling a beaver meadow. There's a road on one side, there's houses on the other, but if you have little features to slow down the water, you're still going to get some backwater, you're going to get some diversity of habitat, you get some of that attenuation. So yes, any form of river restoration is not an all or nothing, it's a continuum. And if you're in the middle of Chicago, there's a limit to what you can do, but you can do something that can still be helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, so post Cameron Peak, just based on limited anecdotal observations, it seems like some areas that had hydric soils that likely were attributed to old beaver activity were more prone to erosion in some areas. So if it's true that beavers are moving around a lot, like is that a potential concern where hydric soils created by relic beaver activity are actually more prone to erosion? Like is that a thing on a scale large enough to be concerned about, and how should we think about that?
So the question was, after the Cameron Peak fire, some of the hydric or those organic rich black soils that I was trying to pose up associated with former beaver meadows seem to be more susceptible to erosion. Like, are you thinking of the really deep, narrow portions of Ocean Creek when you say that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been out to Maya lives up there, and I know where she's talking about. Those are actually less susceptible to erosion than non-beaver areas. The non-beaver areas tend to be very sandy, pebbly soils that are very dry where the conifers grow. Those have less cohesion. The beaver meadow soils have more silt and clay, so they're more cohesive. And yes, there's a very impressive little slack canyon forming in the place you're thinking of. But I would be willing to bet that if you had sandy, pebbly soils there, it would be much wider and just as deep.
So we're CBRW, responding to the fire by doing in-stream work as a means to catch sediment. But I wonder, like, naturally, what, after Hyde Park fire, other fires, what has been the response to beavers? Do they just move out and they build new areas after sediment fills their dams? Like, what would be the natural process that would occur? Or are we just kind of so far outside of what would naturally occur for them to respond to?
So the question was, what would beaver do on their own following fire, or are we so far away from that situation? I can't tell. We are far away in some areas, but they're pretty adaptable. As soon as the willows and the aspen come back, so there's a couple limiting factors for beaver. One is they have to have enough water to have their dam entrance underwater so that they're less susceptible to predators. The other is they get through the winter by eating woody vegetation, deciduous vegetation that is cached during the summer. So if you've ever seen those peeled twigs cached under the ice, that's their winter food supply. Winter's a hard time for them. They can lose 40% of their body weight. That's a very high time period of mortality for adults. But in this place that I've been working in Cameron, by Wohl Creek, at the end of the summer, the aspen was broken as tall as I was. That's in the peaks, in the mud. So I'm sure some beaver die. Either, I don't know if the heat of the fire can actually kept them in their lodges. We have a temperature sensor that actually made it through that fire and recorded the instantaneous temperature of 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. It is the sensor still working. It was instantaneous, but that was flaming. So if they don't die during the fire, there's a lot of hazards afterwards. But if I think if they can make it through the first growing season, they 21 hams in 1 kilometer a day, they work fast. If they have the material, they can survive. So that's a long version of if there's any in the bird areas that we can survive. And we can keep going. There's a nice beaver colony. I don't know the mile marker along the River. That the whole area around it is absolutely lined up with things. There's this one little patch of green, lodges in the middle of the pond. As far as I know, they're still there, so they made it through the fire and
Are beaver repopulating at the rate that population models would predict that they're repopulating? Or is that rate stunted because of development or some other cause?
it's mostly stunted. In natural areas, yeah, they are birds. The continent's biggest bird. They have high population growth rates, but either they're subject to inadvertent mortality, like the cars getting them, or people are killing them, or there's just no habitat. I don't. They're not a protected species in Colorado or any of the western states, so we're not tracking them. But I would guess a lot of 2-year-olds die when they leave the colony because they get them.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious on these sites where we're building DVAs and other type of log structures, how often does that actually assist in beavers repopulating, both in general and in parameters where they might otherwise not?
I have no idea. I can only tell you anecdotal based on what I've seen. So I was involved with putting some DVAs on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountain. We put them in the Beaver Brook, Cow Creek, in the Fall River, and Cow Creek in the Fall River, the beavers built on top of it. Other places I've seen DVAs go in and the beavers don't do anything because there's no beaver in the area. They can migrate a few miles. If any of you are familiar with Wild Basin, we had a project where some of my ecologist colleagues were doing night sampling of red-headed spiders. So they were going up towards like on the Thunder Lake Trail at night, and there was a beaver walking up, which is impressive in a really steep section. So they can move overland a few miles, but again, that's when they're really vulnerable to predation or to being hit by a car. So I think the places where there's DVAs and the beavers don't build on them, there's the beavers can, or there's not enough. But as a proportion, I have no idea.
Is there a minimum water depth, like how deep the water needs to be to support beaver, and like channel width to support enough vegetation?
I would say that that site on the Whitney must be close to them, because in places the channel is literally this deep in August. But when I was there in February, the depth the beaver burned on the top of my chest. So locally, if they create enough of an obstruction, they can create deeper water for themselves. And at the site on the Fox Ranch, which is the electric that's right on the Nebraska border, I didn't see any willows with thicker diameter than my wrist. And they work continuous along the channel, but they were there's several hundred meters or say a half a mile of willow thickets, so it doesn't, I don't know, there are multiple beaver dams there, and multiple beaver lodges, so based on, I guess I'd say they can survive hard times in limited conditions. I don't know what the absolute minimum is. I know I've never seen a beaver in an ephemeral channel where there's no, it goes completely dry. Intermittent means that as you go downstream, there are places with water and places with dry, and they can survive in there. And they can survive in pretty shallow water. It's just winter, food for the light shrubby willows.
On behalf of all. So you mentioned in restoring mountain watersheds, if we've lost a lot of the beads, you had the two scenarios of restoring more beads downstream and more beads upstream in the headwaters. And you said restoring the headwater streams would be more beneficial. Can you go a little bit more into that? Like why?
Yeah, so if you think of, if my hand up is the watershed, and these are all the tributaries. If you get things driven down there after Cameron Creek or Hyde Park, they build up a lot of momentum and you're turning a lot of sediment and you're going downstream into a big flash flood or debris flow. If you can stop them before they go too far, you can really attenuate this flexibility. I think that's going to be more important. The other thing, my hand is not a good analogy for this anymore, but based on total channel length, the little channels move. So we refer to stream orders. A first order stream has no tributary. The second order stream has two first order streams coming together. 70 to 80% of the total channel length in any river that is under the Mississippi is in those first and second order channels. So by far the vast majority of the total river is. So if you can slow things down there, that's really the greatest effect.
Sorry, I had a question off of that. In terms of like, in an environment of limited resources, ideally you're saying like the majority of, if we can address all of those first or second streams, that would have the largest impact because we're slowing it from the beginning. But in terms of like our capacity to do restoration to that degree, like that's obviously more than we can address. And so when we're talking about like the strings and beads, how would you prioritize then in terms of like, should we just then work on restoring beads and dabble in first order streams, or how would you like approach that problem knowing you can't do everything?
Beads, prioritize beads, second and third order. The first order channel in Colorado, I would be across. I mean, they're really, really small. You're not going to get through this. You could have log jams or individual pieces of wood. Log jams. So second order, third order, maybe fourth order. And realistically, it's prioritization of where can we get to, who's going to let us work. But as many as possible. The facts. I'm just providing jobs.
Yeah. Well, that's perfect. Thank you all so much for joining. We'll give another round of applause. They do, New Belgium closes at 8, so I don't know if they already did last call, but grab a last drink, say your last questions, or meander, talk to people, tell them. Thank you for joining us. Yeah.